Okay. So welcome to Perashat Vaethanan. It is so nice to be here in person. It's so nice to see your beautiful faces. I see your beautiful faces every week, but it's definitely a treat to be here live. Today we're going to start in Perashat Vaethanan. Last week we started the Sefer Devarim, and I believe that Perashat Vaethanan is very, very closely related to what happened at the end of last week's Perashah. So first, before turning back, but I would like to draw in the previous Parshiyah. Let's start first this week, Devar Yom Beyomo. So we're going to start this week with the first verse of Perashat Vaethanan. You'll find it in your Kumashim. It's chapter 3, verse 23. And the pasuk starts with Vaethanan el Hashem ba'et hahi lemor. Just that one pasuk tells an entire story. Of course, the word Vaethanan is a word that we have to address. It's not such a common word used in Torah. It's actually very sparsely used. We see the word chen, the word favor or grace, in the word Vaethanan, but it means something very specific. It actually means two very specific things if we trace the word Vaethanan. So it's not just chen, there's a second nun there. So it is Hanan. What does the word Hanan mean? What is Moshe doing at this time? So let's first notice a few things about the pasuk. The first thing is you don't notice Moshe's name. We know that Moshe is the speaker. We know that the Moshe is the one, excuse me. You need a chumash from inside if you don't mind. Okay, I'm sorry for all the technical craziness, but the word Vaethanan is here without a person attached to it. So this word, whatever it means, it has a removal of the person. It's as if the person themselves is shrinking so small that they're not in the verse altogether. Maybe I should start by saying, Vaethanan in the English said, I implored, I beseeched, I requested, I pleaded, is what the word might mean if we only looked at the English. And maybe I should take a minute and tell you what's going on here. And this Sefer, are you going downstairs? I closed it, but they opened it. So I apologize. If I take us, they're having a story downstairs. They're having they bring a bus in from somewhere once a year. Oh, so there you go. Back to us again. I apologize. This idea, what's taking place in Perashat Vaethanan, maybe we should go to the macro before we go into the micro. The macro version of Vaethanan, what's really taking place here is Moshe is pleading with God because he wants to enter the land of Israel. So that's really, once we have that picture, we could start to understand what is Moshe's methodology? What avenue does he take? And really the question is, what avenue do we take when we want to make a request that's already been denied? We are opening up a box that's already been sealed. God has already told him, Moshe, you're not going in with the people. Moshe, you are staying on this side and they're all going in. So for us to read this, it opens up so many questions like, Can we get God to change his mind when he's already said no? And in this case, we're going to have to talk about what happens. Does Moshe actually get what he asks for? And it's a very big question, a religious question, and we have to see how the Torah is going to address that. You had a question.
I feel like the way that the pasuk start, Moshe almost becomes the verb. He almost subtracts himself. It is so heartbreaking to me that he really becomes the plea.
So what's being said, I'm going to just tell our Zoomers here. Remind me your name?
Rena.
Rena?
Yeah.
So Rena's making a beautiful comment, and she's saying what happens when somebody wants something so badly, they become one and the same with that mission, with that request. It consumes their entirety, that they no longer have an identity that is aside from this Vaethanan. At this point, Moshe has become, and Rita said it beautifully, Rina, right? Rina said it beautifully. He's one and the same with this verb, Vaethanan. And so what does the word Vaethanan really mean? Like we said, the English seems to say to implore or beseech or beg or plead. Before we talk about what the word means, who is Moshe asking? Is he asking Hashem Eloheinu? Is he asking Et HaElohim? He's asking Hashem. He knows that the greatest chance that he has to have a positive outcome to his question is by asking the God of Rachamim, the God who is going to be most open to his request. So we have Vaetchanan el Hashem, and then we have these words, Ba'et hahi, at that exact time. What exact time? Why did Moshe feel that page 958 was the best time to petition or to rally or to try and make an effort to get what he wanted? He could have asked this 2 pages earlier, 2 pages later. Again, when we read Torah, every word is very, very important. So when it says at this particular time, what gates were open that he felt that his, if he was a lawyer, let's say, if he was pleading his case, why would this exact time be the perfect time to plead his case, Sharon?
If you go back to Pesukim, it uses the word Ba'et.
Yes. Yes. So Sharon is doing already what we mentioned at the beginning of the class, which is Moshe's request is hinging on the end of last week's Perashat. So what did happen? They conquered Sichon ve'og, beautiful. And then Yehoshua's in charge, beautiful. So if you want to say,
Can I go without being in charge?
Can I go as a layman? I know that I was denied my visa to go as the leader, but what if I go as a civilian? Would I be able to go under those conditions? That's a beautiful chidush. That's Sharon's chidush. That's not mine. What else from last week might make Moshe feel that he stands a chance, that he has a shot, that maybe now's the perfect time? And by the way, when we want to make a petition, timing is everything. You ask for something and the boss is in a bad mood, you didn't even finish your sentence. And
maybe because it's the end of his life.
Somebody's saying because it's the end of his life. I don't know who is saying that.
It's Rochelle.
So Rochelle is asking, is it because it's a last request, a final request? Even a prisoner gets a last cigarette to smoke. Maybe he's saying, okay, God, I accept that I'm going to die, but before I go, grant me this under the umbrella of it's my final request. After this, you're not going to be bothered by me anymore. I'm not going to be here. I'm not going to ask for anything else, which is also a beautiful way to look at it. let's also just look at a very practical situation that Moshe sees an opening, and that's our job. When we want to make a request, we have to look for an opening. In legal terms, they may call it a precedence. You may want to make this request or submit your petition because there's been precedence. And what is the precedence that was there? Oh, so Sophia is saying, wait a minute. Last week, God said, or we're recording that God said, that we have a new thing that could happen, that you could actually stay on the other side of the Yarden, which is Moshe, where he's going to be on there. But Reuven, Gad, and half of Shevet Menashe were granted a temporary visa, meaning they're going to go into the land and then they're going to come back and settle here. So Moshe is saying, hey, wait a minute. I understand that I can't go and live with the other tribes in Eretz Yisrael, but maybe I can go together with the contingency, with that group, with the condition that I'll go and I'll come back. And that's what last week ends up on. Last week, if you see verse 18, that Sharon already connected the Ba'et Hahi in our first verse with this Ba'et Hahi. Va'etzav etchem ba'et hahi lemor. At that exact time, I told you that God is going to give you the land to inherit, but you, the three tribes, chalutzim ta'avru lifnei achichem. You're going to go like pioneers. You're going to go as the trendsetters. You're going to go in the first front row in front of your brothers, and only your wives and your children and your livestock, because I know you have a lot of livestock, they will stay here on this side of the Jordan. And only once God gives all of the properties and all of the nachalot, all of the portions of land to your brothers, only once they have their lands secured, then you too could come to this side of the Jordan River. This is what's being said. Okay, so that's a great question. How many years would that be? It's actually not so long, because the book of Yehoshua, which is right after this book, so it's all going to happen in Yehoshua's lifetime. Yehoshua is going to take them into the land. They're going to conquer Yericho. They're going to have the war against the Ai. They're going to have their skirmishes and battles. And by the end of the book of Yehoshua, in Yehoshua's lifetime, they're going to have a lottery. And by lottery, they're going to give each person their property. So it's not going to be such a big span of time. Exactly, I don't know how long. I probably could do the math based on when Yehoshua died, but I don't think it was a very big span of time. So Moshe is saying, let me go in. You already have an amboy bus that's going to take these guys, bring these guys back. I'll hop on that bus. I'll come back with them. And of course, let's keep going back to our parasha. So that also might be what gave Moshe the opening to say, where timing is everything, that God could have said, you know what? I'm sending 2.5 tribes. What's one more person? I'll let him go and come back. And now we have our lesson for today. Now we understand, when we're going to read the next few verses, we're going to see that God says no. But we're going to see what he says, how he says it, why he says it, but most importantly, what does that mean to us? How does God's response affect us? So it's the next verse. And of course, the word is lemor, when we already know what the answer is going to be if we're a sharp reader of the text. How do we know what God's answer is going to be without even reading any further? Because Vaethanan el Hashem Ba'et Hahi lemor. This is what's happening in this verse, just so we're clear. Moshe is recapping and retelling the story of his conversation with God. And in the recap of the conversation that he had with God, what word is used here? Lemor, meaning it was a one-way conversation. It was a monologue. The response that God gives was not something that was a dialogue. We didn't have a debate over it. I said it, and let's see what happens. What did I say? Adonai Hashem, ata hachilota leharot et avdecha. God, you have begun to show me, your servant, again, we hear and we start to get this idea when the person calls themselves the what? The servant. They're being subservient because they want what? They want a gracious response from the person that is controlling the situation. We're going to see it exactly in 1 second. So remember that. You've shown me your greatness, your strong hand. Mi el bashamayim uba'aretz. There's no God, not in the heavens and not in the earths, that even compares to your deeds or your greatness. And then here is the request. E'ebrana, please let me cross over. And we had this word avor last week a lot, and we discussed it to mean a ma'avad, which is a bridge. Let me be the bridge. I don't just want to go to the land and come back for selfish purposes. I feel that the people need a sense of continuum. So rather than just send Yehoshua, let me be the bridge. Let me bridge between the two. Yehoshua will take them in, but let me, so to speak, the imagery is for a bridge. Let me have one foot on one side of the Jordan and the other foot in the land of Israel. And they'll sort of, you get the imagery from this avod word, from this pass over me. Let me be the one, even if I could serve. You know, when somebody is so desperate to be invited to a dignitary event or whatever, I'll be the waiter. I'll be the usher. I'll do anything. I'll be the guy who hands out the pamphlets. I'll be the bridge, says Moshe. It doesn't matter. I'll reduce myself to even that. I just want to have one foot in the land. And we sort of feel a little tragic. We feel a little sense of, come on, give the guy a break. This was his life's work. From the minute he was born, from the minute he was called to task, what was his job? To take the people from point A to point B. He takes the people from point A. He drags them and himself for 40 years through a desert. And it's very heartbreaking to not see the fruits of your labor, to not see the culmination of all of your efforts. And Moshe is asking, I can't blame a guy for asking. I feel for him very, very strongly. We're going to talk about this a little bit more, but for now, he says, please, let me just what? Let me just see. Let me just see the Aretz HaTova. I know. Now, why am I saying Haaretz HaTova? The people who didn't get to go in are people who didn't think it was an Eretz Tova. God, I always thought it was a beautiful land. I believed in the project. I believed in the dream. Let me just see it with my own eyes. Let me see. Hahar HaTov. I want to see everything to Moshe about the land is related to Tov, is goodness. And the Lebanon, let me see the Lebanon, but Vayit Aber Hashem bi, the same word, E'ebra, Be'eved, the same request is met with the response, the same word, Vayit Aber Hashem bi. God sort of crossed over me. And then he uses these words, Lema anchem, because of you. And he didn't listen to me. And you know what God said? Rav lecha, too much, enough. Don't continue to speak to me on this matter. Badavar hazeh tosef daber elai, od badavar hazeh, in the book of Devarim. Moshe, I know you're a master spokesman, and I know you can talk your way into anything. And you've talked your way into many salvations. I was going to kill the people a zillion times. And you talked your way out of it and you saved them. And I know that you're a master with your language. So I'm going to ask you, says God, I don't want to discuss this subject. The subject is now closed. That's how I'm reading it here. I'm going to put a completely different spin on it, or maybe you will. Yes.
So I don't understand the switch in the audience. So Vaethanan is Hashem, is he pleading right here Vaethahi to Hashem, but then it sounds he's talking to the people.
I think you and Rina should be a chevruta, because why? He is so invested in this story that even while he's telling the story of the past, it has become, he is so consumed by it, it has become his present, and he is a better one. These people that he's speaking with are not to blame. They weren't involved with the spies. They weren't the ones who complained to water that got him to completely lose his cool. These are not those people. And so because of that, we have to read this differently. And we have to say, is Moshe really at this point? This is his swan song. This is it. This is his soft pasuk. At any minute on any page, it's over. They're going to cross. He's not. We're standing. We know when Sefer Devarim starts, we're in the 11th month of the 40th year. So where exactly we are, I couldn't tell you, but we don't have anything more than a month to play with. So do we really think that in his last month, Moshe's final words to his people are going to be, gee, thanks for nothing. Because of you, you're all going to go have a beautiful vacation. You get to go, and I have to what? Do we really think that of Moshe Rabbeinu? I don't. And that's why I'm going to choose to read it differently. And I'm going to choose to read it like this. That's what's so beautiful about Torah. You could just give it a 2-degree twist and it means something completely different. And what Moshe is really saying here is Vayit Aber bi. But God, and over here it says, became angry with me. So this is, I'm glad for you to see it in the English, because Vayit Aber bi doesn't mean God angry with me. It means that he passed me over, but wait. Lema anchem, for your sake, for your benefit. And that makes a very big difference. For the benefit of who did God pass over Moshe?
This new generation.
You want to say the new generation? You want to say the people? Could you widen your lens a little bit? For the reader in every generation of Torah, for the sake of us here today, which is the words exactly that Moshe is going to use in about a half a second. If you just see Pasuk 4, for instance, turn the page in chapter 4, where he says, Atem hadevekim b'Hashem Elohechem, you who are clinging to Hashem, Chaim kulchem hayom. You know what's the secret to stay alive? What's the secret to staying alive? Is clinging and attaching yourself to God. So when we read these words, we can't just read them as, oh, this is what Moshe was telling them back then. This is when you see this word hayom, anytime in any part of the Torah, you see the word hayom today, it means what? Today in 2021, the Torah is meant to be read as a living, breathing entity. And so what Moshe is telling these people, this generation that is going to be privileged to go into the land, he's telling to us as well. So what is he saying? He's saying it was for your sake. It was not just lema'anchem, but letovatchem, for your own good. What cost me benefited you. What Moshe is really saying is God was looking at the big picture. And if I had to be the sacrifice for that, and you'll see now how he reads it, he says, Vayit'aber Hashem bi lema'anchem, Velo shama elai. He wouldn't even listen to me, because why? Because if God would listen to me, what would happen? He would grant it, because he is a God that does listen, that does change his mind, and that does grant requests when necessary and when appropriate. And that's why God had to say, please stop talking, because if you say one more word, I'm going to let you go in. And if I let you go in, it might serve you, but it won't serve humanity. It won't serve future generations. And so here is where it gets, thank you. This is why it's so great to be live. For what reason, what purpose does it serve? How does it serve humanity? Is that your question? How does it serve human? How do I and we benefit from God saying no to Moshe? And he doesn't just say no. Remember this, and this is for us. This is what he's saying for us in life. He's giving us a life lesson, every one of us. He's saying, Rav lach. 2 words. Rav means what? I'm curious to see what the English says. It's too much for you. Don't look at the English today. Stay with me for 1 minute. What God is telling Moshe is what he's telling us. And Moshe is repeating it because he wants us to know. When we want something so badly that we become one and the same with that want, with that need. And sometimes it's not going to happen for us. And sometimes we're not going to get it. How are we going to cope? How are we going to move forward? I've become that entity. I'm consumed with the desire for something. How am I going to move forward when that desire isn't met? Go on Amazon and read any self-help book about happiness, about contentment, about acceptance, Google any of those words, and I guarantee you every single book will draw from this pasuk, which means ravlach. Stop focusing on what you don't have. Yeah, you're not getting to go into the land. And what happens when we don't get that one thing that we want, what happens? We're miserable. It becomes consuming. You could make a whole meal.
You're unable to see good.
You can't see the good. I'll give you just a tiny example. You make a whole meal and everybody tells you it was delicious, it was great, this was the best, and one person says something was too salty. What happens? If you're a cook, you forgot that everything else was the best, that the roast beef was the most tender, and that the string beans were perfect and crispy. You forget everything that you did good, and all day you're beating yourself up on why did you mess up that one thing. There's a happiness ratio. It's called 5-to-1, and it's a crazy ratio. When our body needs 5 compliments to every insult. 1 insult takes up the space of 5 compliments. And if you think of yourself, the truth of the matter is, you could do 1,000,000 great things. Do we compliment ourselves enough on our successes? Do we compliment ourselves half as much on our successes as we do on our failures? God is here to tell Moshe, don't look at this as a failure. You're seeing this as a deficiency. You became consumed by it. You can't see straight. You can't think straight. You don't even exist. It's a Vaethanan. Your name is not even in the verse anymore. You lost your sense of self because you feel that if you don't cross this barrier, that what's going to happen?
Everything you did was nothing.
Now, should I make a resume for Moshe? Go to a headhunter and say, as Moshe, and the headhunter is going to say, well, what have you done? What marketable skills do you have? And on that resume, I don't have to write it. The Torah is his resume. from speaking to pharaohs to splitting seas. What can I tell you? What hasn't Moshe done? To being on a mountain for 40 days and 40 nights with no food to sustain him, to speaking face to face with the divine. What should I tell you? He's getting water out of rocks. I mean, the guy is definitely, I'm saying it in a sarcastic way, there is no more accomplished person than Moshe Rabbeinu on the planet. But Moshe Rabbeinu, if he were to write his own biography, at this point today in Vaethanan, it seems to us that what grade would he give himself? Don't answer that question because it's very hurtful. But the reason I ask it is because what grade do we give ourselves? We do a million good things. We mess up in one part or one place or one story, or something happens. You make a party and you forgot to order the napkins with the name. That's all you could think about. How did I miss that? How could I be so stupid? And then all of a sudden, we grab hold of that one. I always use that same, if you ever watch Seinfeld, the red dot on the sweater.
Yeah.
The whole sweater's cashmere and there's one little red dot, but that's the only thing you could see. That's us. We only see our flaws. And Moshe is saying, I'm repeating this story. Moshe, we know the story already. We already know by the time we get to page 958 that Moshe is not getting into the land. We know that. It's not news to us. But why is he repeating it? And why is he repeating it in this way? Because he's saying, you know what? Up until now, I've been blaming you, because that's another whole class for another day, that when we don't get what we want, we do what? We blame somebody else. It's somebody else's fault. Had it not been, it's bad either way. Either we blame ourselves, I should have, I could have, I would have, and we beat ourselves up, or we blame somebody else. Because of you and because of your actions and because you wouldn't stop nagging and complaining and I had to hit a rock and lose my temper, and because you had to send spies into the land, now what happened? So what is he saying in this pasuk? That God, these are Moshe's words. This is another very important thing to consider when you're reading the pasuk. This is not God dictating to Moshe. This is Moshe at the end of his life sharing with us his experiences. And his experiences are, number one, he's not saying because of you, he's saying for your sake, because God is not petty, because God is not tit for tat, because God has so much rahmanut and chesed and greatness that he could grant, and he would have, like we said, if Moshe said one more word. But he asked me to stop. Because why? Because for your sake, one thing we could tell ourselves when we don't get what we want is Moshe Rabbeinu didn't get what he wanted. Because what happens when we don't get what we want? Hashem's not listening to me. Hashem doesn't love me. Hashem abandoned me. What do we say? We say these things to ourselves, and those are very defeating things to say. There's not a second door. Don't bother.
No, I'm just gonna tell them.
I'll close the door.
No,
Thank
tell them
you.
to go downstairs. I don't think they know they have to go
Huh?
downstairs.
No, they're coming from downstairs.
Okay, they're coming up.
They're going to next door.
Okay,
I'm sorry
thank
for
you.
the,
Thank you.
Okay.
No, thank you for housing us and hosting
no,
us.
a pleasure. Once a year, we treat the ladies sometimes more than the men. You should know,
That's
you
beautiful.
know, because these ladies, they don't come to deal.
I know, there's
And
more.
they want to come to deal. Very expensive to come to deal. You're lucky you're here. So
Excuse
what
us
we
one
do,
second.
my sister, she runs the program, and she brings 2 buses. She brings the lady, we give them lunch, we give them singing, Vartorah, some stories. My sister.
It's Rosie.
No, her name Violet Chikuri.
Oh.
She does a lot of shidduchim also. If somebody needs shidduch, call her.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you.
Okay.
So keep up the beautiful work and thank you for hosting us. I appreciate it.
It's a pleasure to have your husband here in our show.
Ah, thank you. He loves it. Thank you. Thank you. So back to our story. What is Moshe telling us on his final days? He's not saying that God didn't do it because he couldn't do it. He's saying when you come to a point in your life where God says no, know very well, number one, that Moshe Rabbeinu was also denied. So if you think you're better than Moshe Rabbeinu, you have a bigger problem than we could handle. But the first thing you should do, says Moshe, because that's not going to help you when you don't get what you want, knowing that somebody else didn't get what they wanted. That's not going to help you. He gives us a practical application, which is what? I may not have A or B or C, but I do have D, E, F, G, H, and I. Make a gratitude list. Rav, when he says Rav Lach, he's saying, stop focusing on your deficiencies, on your don't haves, and focus on what you do have. And the minute you do that, your entire picture and perspective will change dramatically. Instead of looking this way at the negative column, look, it's the same exact effort, right? I could focus on this or I could focus on that. But Moshe is touching something deeper, and he's touching a human tendency. He's making us aware that for some reason we are more attracted. I don't know why the brain has been wired this way. We're more attracted. You know, you put on bad news, you put on something scandalous. For some reason, the brain is attracted towards something that is negative. And so back here, when he says, Al tosef dabere la'od, badavar hazeh, you coming here? Okay. What does Moshe say next? I'm in verse 27. Ale rosh hapiska, go to the head, go to the top of the cliff. Vesa einecha. What is God telling us today? I know what he's telling Moshe. Moshe is telling us that God said, go to the top of the cliff and look to all the directions, the north, the east, the south, the west, and get a visual. What is he telling us? Today, here.
To lift yourself up.
Lift yourself up. Very easy. I told you, I'm saving you money on Amazon. Every book is going to tell you to do the same thing, which is what? Take pride in what you've done and change your perspective. Change your view. Look at things from a different angle. I'm saving you a fortune. This is
Still not getting what you really want.
you may, because it may, did you just hear what Rena said? If you get a different perspective, it may change, it may not change what you want, but you might change the degree to which you want it. And guess what? If the answer is no, and I can't change that, I can change the way I deal with it. I can't change a no. Some things, by the way, are final, right? Death, taxes, there are certain things that it is what it is. And it's finite and it's definitive and I can't change them. But if I do what? If I change my perspective and I say, I don't have this, I have to pay this. I'm using taxes easier than that. So if I have to pay X, somebody said a very smart thing. It shouldn't hurt you to write your tax return, because the more you pay means the more you made. And if you only focus on how much they're taking out of your salary, then you're not focused on how much you actually brought in. It's a silly analogy, but if you change your perspective, it will do you good. And changing your perspective in the English terminology, take the high ground, take the high road, go to the Rosh HaPiskah, elevate yourself, get out from the dumps, from the bottom, from the valley, pick yourself up.
Also, it's like rolling stones on a field. Like you can't always get what you want, but you get what you need. Like sometimes not getting what you want opens the door to what you need.
I love that. So Sharon, I'm going to repeat what she said because I don't know if our Zoomers were able to hear us. And that is that she compared it to the Rolling Stones that say you can't always get what you want, but you what?
If you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need.
But if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need. And that's something very, very profound. It's okay. Yesterday we quoted Billy Joel. Today we're quoting the Rolling Stones. Guess what? It's all knowledge. The world has what to offer, and we need to look at everything to gain from it. Did you? Yes.
It's also, I mean, I'm sure everybody has this with parenting. As much as you want something for your kid, and your kid has a mind of his own or her own, they're entitled to their independence. You have to step back and say, listen, I want this and this and this. It's not always, you're not always always in control of everything.
Right. And sometimes it's not in your own best interest. So what's being said just for our Zoomers is, even as a parent, and God here is the parent, and he's saying, I can't always give you everything that you ask for. You have your plan, and that's another tiny piece. Did you want to say something? Did I interrupt you?
Yeah, it bothers me because just because he made a mistake with the water, he has to pay such big consequences. But look at all the good things that he did.
I think that's the best comment I heard all day. So I'm going to repeat the comment because it's the best comment. And what's your name?
Jeannie.
And Jeannie is saying it hurts her and it bothers her to think that God is so, I don't want to use the word vindictive or so punishing. Thank you. That God is so punishing that you make one little mistake and what happens?
Yeah.
And now your whole life's work is down the
But
tubes.
Vivien, it's on the level of Moshe was. He wouldn't do that to us.
Okay, so Sharon's responding and saying, we're not Moshe Rabbeinu. The tzaddikim are judged kechut hase'ara. So for Moshe, it may have been different on the scales. You're still not happy with that. I see you're very upset because you view God as a God that is so compassionate. And where's the compassion when we need it?
The good things that he did.
And how about if we consider all the good things that God did as well? We're taking out of the equation all of the kindnesses that God did do,
God did it through him, actually.
or did it through him. And there's I'm going to say one thing before I go back to Rena. There's a very important concept that we have to, I think Vaethanan teaches us more than anything. And this is Leilui Nishmato of Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. This was the way he signed every one of his weekly parasha leaflets or messages. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. Velo ata ben chorin lebatel mimen. I'll say it in English. No one person is intended to complete an entire task. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. The world, you have to go to the bigger picture. And in order for the world to continue, and we could see it with leaders, if a leader doesn't have a successor, does his job ends when he ends. If you have a mayor that doesn't bring a successor to continue the programs that he put in place, then what happens? Everything that his job not only doesn't continue, but a lot of it erodes. So if you think that your 4 years in office is you're going to finish your job, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. We need to have successors, and maybe, just maybe this is placed here to answer your question. Maybe the real reason that Moshe didn't go into Eretz Yisrael was maybe either we needed a different leader for a different generation. We have a different group of people, a different mindset. So much so that in this week's Perashat, when Moshe is going to repeat the 10 commandments, they're going to be told in a different way with different perspectives. Because why? This is a different generation. The same generation that came out of Egypt is not in the same mindset as the generation that's going to go into the land of Israel. I'm going to use an example in a minute about that. But you have to speak up, I'm sorry.
Go that way.
When Hashem specifies as to why Moshe is not allowed into the land, that pasuk, does it say, forgive me, I don't know, does it say in black and white the reason you are not going into the land is because of the incident?
So there, So there are a few instances. Moshe himself blames the rock instance, the rock water where he hit the rock. He also blames the spies incident. Let's not, Moshe. And God also says nobody other than Yehoshua and Caleb after the spy incident. I don't know, I have to see. I don't know, I have to check the wording. I would have to take a few minutes and analyze it, but you can do it while you're here. Yes.
So how many times has he asked for this ruling to be switched?
Okay, so the question that's being asked is, how many times has Moshe asked for the ruling to be switched? I don't have a precise number, but it seems when it says Vaethanan el Hashem Vaet Hahi, at that time, you and I don't know exactly when that time is. This is all a repetition. He could have asked 100 times, 1,000 times, 4 times. Not everything that happens is actually recorded. I think what we have to focus on is what is recorded, which is once you get to the word Vaethanan, so let's start with that. He didn't just ask. At this point, I think he asked knowing what the answer was already, which means that what? That he asked already various times, multiple times, and the answer was always no, so I have to change it. This word Vaethanan. So let's take a minute.
My question was, why is he doing this lesson on Moshe? He could have done it with.
He's doing it on every one of us.
Everyone.
Guess what?
Doing it here.
No, he does it with every one of us. I'm glad you asked that. She says, why is he doing it just with Moshe? He's not doing it just with Moshe. Everybody, like the Rolling Stone says, doesn't get exactly what they want. That's how life works. Life works that we're going to have disappointments, or our view of what we should have and we should accomplish and we should do is not always going to be match up exactly with our reality. I may think I'm supposed to be I don't know what, and then I'm only this, and then I'm going to measure myself based on my deficiency. I'm not going to measure myself on maybe I was supposed to be down there and I'm up here. We always measure ourselves which way? On what I could have been, on how much more I could have had, how much smarter, how much prettier, how much richer, how much thinner, whatever it is that you view as an ideal. Somehow humanity always sees themselves as falling short of that ideal because our eyes are bigger, our view of ourselves are sometimes bigger, our view of our ideal is always going to be great because we have imaginations, because we were gifted with this greatness, with this breadth and width of psyche. And so we're always going to feel like we missed something. And that's just the point. And that's just the point. God is saying, if you think that you reached your ideal, if you think you reached your pinnacle, we should never leave this world saying, I did it. I checked every box on my list. If you checked every box on your list, then you didn't make the right list. Your list wasn't long enough. You always have to leave something unchecked on your box, which means that every minute that you were on this planet, you were striving to get something done. The minute you leave and you say, I did what I did, that's probably why you left, because you didn't have something else on your to-do list. A good advice is always have a to-do list that's bigger, but also at the same time, have the lo alecha hamlacha ligmor attitude. Because if you think that you have to finish everything on yourself, then that's going to be debilitating. So there's a very strong balance that we're going to see here. I wanted to take you, so I didn't have time in the introduction. I'm sorry, we were a little distracted, but if you only could read, if I had a nickel for every time I said this, if you could only read one perashah, really reading through Vaethanan is a very strong recommendation because it has a sprinkling of the entire Torah in Vaethanan. It has the Shema. It has the 10 Commandments. It has parts of the Haggadah. Avadim hayinu leparo b'Mitzrayim. It has so many aspects for us to govern our lives with that if you only had to get one perashah, it takes us back to Bereshit. It uses, that Sefer Devarim uses the term ha'adam 7 times. You know me and the number 7 in the book of Devarim. What does that mean? Let's think about this. If we consider the Sefer Torah like a scroll that is round, so Devarim and Bereshit are going to what? Are going to meet. We see it on Simchat Torah when we finish Devarim and go straight into Bereshit. So for that matter, it's a two-way street. Devarim goes straight into Bereshit, but don't think for 1 minute that Bereshit doesn't have its influence on Devarim. And of this word, ha'adam, we could talk about this as a whole class in and of itself, but I'll just give you a few snippets. Moshe could use any word to describe humanity. But when he uses the word Adam, there is a humbling aspect to it, but it's intended to take the reader back to our very beginning, our very origins. And the fact that it lists it 7 times is here to remind us that as long as we are Adam, as long as we are men, as long as we are comprised of flesh and blood, we are going to have limitations. And Perashat Vaethanan, if it's anything, it's about accepting our limitations. Because if we don't accept our limitations, we're not going to be able to move forward on any aspect. And so I'm just going to give you a couple of little examples so you'll feel that you had a flavor of the Perashah. We looked at the Chayim Kulchem Hayom in verse 4, chapter 4, which means Moshe is telling us something very important. Nothing new. Kohelet en chadash tachat hashemesh. There's nothing new taking place here. Meaning, what's taking place here is taking place, always has been, always will be. These are truths that are universal and timeless. What are the truths? So some of them are, we're going to put a lot of emphasis in this Perashah on the Avodah Zarah, on the commandment to not have other gods. And why is that? In our Perashah that has the Shema and the Haggadah and the 10 Commandments, why is there so much of a stress put on Avodah Zarah, on worshiping idols? Why is that one of the strongest? You can look in any pasuk. You could look in pasuk 15 and pasuk 23 and pasuk 25, all in chapter 4. You'll see over and over this pesel, this temunah. Don't make any other gods. What's so important to Moshe at this point in his life that he feels he needs to pound this point home? You could pound so many points. Why the point of not having a foreign deity?
Because they're going into a land that has people that have.
So up until now, for 40 years, that's what you were going to say, up until now. So notice the shift. Moshe is speaking to a people that's now going to be exposed. They are now going to have streaming to them in every minute temptations to be like the other nations. And what's Moshe's, if he only has one thing to tell the people, what does he want to tell them? If you're Moshe, to cling to God, to not be, thank you, mommy, to not be like everybody else, which is what? Don't forget who you are. If Moshe left us with one message, it's that we are an Am Segulah, that we are a nation that doesn't abide by the natural laws that all of the other nations abide by. And it's saying something even stronger still. It's saying if you feel the need to construct a foreign idol, this is, I think, one of the most serious messages of the Torah. If you feel the need, and I'm going to rephrase it, to create something that will control you, what are you really doing? When you take a piece of wood or a piece of stone and you chisel it and you deem it your boss, the one who controls you, that's what an avodah zarah is, right? That's what pesel is. That's what a temunah is. It's ma'aseh yedei adam. I gave away one of the Adams right there, which comes in this perashah. When you take ma'aseh yedei adam, actually, let's look at it together. It's right here in chapter 4, verse 28. One of the pitfalls is Ve'avadetem sham Elohim ma'aseh yedei adam. This is what you said. You're going to go there. You're going to see that they all have this practice. It's going to be very in vogue. You're going to want to be current and popular and in with the crowd who's doing this. And so what are you going to do? You are going to worship Ma'aseh Yedei Adam, the handiwork of man. It's either etz or even. It's wood or it's stone. And what's the irony? This wood and stone doesn't even have the 5 senses. It can't see, it can't hear, it can't taste, it can't smell. What's the worst thing that happens when we relinquish our own control, when we relinquish our own sense of importance, and we put it on an inanimate object? What happens to us? We ourselves, now we become synonymous with this object. We're so attached to it. We identify ourselves by it. We lose our humanity. We lose our sense of smell, our sense of sight, our sense of hearing. We don't even realize that. What did we do? We relinquished our selves, our creative greatness. And so what is tied with that? Ubikashtem misham et Hashem Elohecha. And maybe this is a nice way to pair the Pesukim, because it's saying, it's like Pinocchio. The minute that you decide that you want to cut those strings, that you want to be your own person, because what are you like when you're worshiping idols? You're a puppet on a string. You're being controlled. You're being controlled with your own creation. How crazy and ironic is that? You create something and that thing controls you. It's the tail wagging the dog. Thank you. And what happens, says Moshe, that will happen. And once that happens, since you're really not made of wood, since you really can see, and you really do have all the senses that you were created, this is where it comes from. When you come to your senses, as opposed to losing all your senses, when you come back to your senses, what's going to happen? You're going to ask for Hashem Elohecha. You're going to ask for Hashem, your God. And you're going to find him. Why? Just because you looked for him. There's a little bit of the Dorothy in this story, right? When you realize that you are already home, when you realize that you already have a brain or you already have the thing you're looking for, that's when you're going to find it. But something interesting has to happen. When you lose your way, you need 2 avenues. You need an emotional avenue and you need a physical avenue. You have to search in order to come back home. You can't just flip a switch and say, okay, I'm done with that. The exercise for you to return from this place where you lost yourself, you're going to have to return. You're going to have to make the decision where? First, in your heart. It sounds like just a mental exercise, but they're using the heart also to represent a physical component. And bechol nafshecha, and your entire soul, your entire being. So before you go off the path, I'll say it this way, coming back to center is not going to be easy. But if you make a concerted decision and an effort, and you make that your choice, then you will find God. So Moshe is starting to give us some of the pitfalls, some of the ways to recover. I'm just going to end with the 10 commandments because I feel bad if we didn't even touch on them today. In chapter 5 of Devarim, Moshe calls Kol Yisrael, all of Yisrael, which is another terminology which appears 13 times in the book of Devarim. The words Kol Yisrael meaning, what's it going to take for us to be a nation that is united and intact and whole? This words Kol Yisrael, anytime you see them, one of them is that we have to have a set of rules that we all abide by, which is going to be now our 10 commandments. But even in the 10 commandments, we start to see, of course, in the first 3 verses, not to have any other gods. But I want to focus my attention for a minute today on the Shabbat. It seems to be 2 different words used. Here it says Shamor et Yom HaShabbat, and we already know that in Parashat Yitro it says Zachor et Yom HaShabbat. But we don't just have 2 different words to introduce that commandment. We have 2 completely different reasons for keeping those commandments. How could I have 2 different reasons? How could I have in Shemot 1 reason to keep the Shabbat and in Devarim a different reason to keep Shabbat? And you guys started to answer that by saying, my audience changed. And with a change of audience, my message has to change. What was the message? What was the reason that we kept the Shabbat in Parashat Yitro? And if you want to see it, you could turn to page 410, which is chapter 20, Pasuk 8, 410, page 410. And we'll end with this. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat lekodsho. This is being said to whom? To the first generation who just left Egypt a minute ago. Remember the Shabbat, sanctify it, 6 days do all your work, and on the 7th day, Shabbat for God, don't do any work, not you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your maidservant or your animals or your aliens that are in your gates. Because, what's the reason I have to keep Shabbat? Because God created the world in 6 days. What am I telling the first generation? What am I doing?
You create familiarity.
I'm connecting them to where? I'm connecting them to the beginning of time. I'm taking the present and doing what? I'm pulling it all the way back to the beginning of time. What else am I doing? What else was happening in Sinai at that time? What was happening? Man was reconnecting to who? To God. Not just familiarity. The axes of relationship to the first generation was what? Was take humanity from below all the way up to God and connect with him that way. That was what the plan of Sinai was. Connecting earth to heaven, man to God, present to past. Can you see all of those axes in your mind? Now that I gave you those, hold those in your mind for what's happening in Parashat Devarim. And in Parashat Devarim, when we're going to keep the Shabbat, you know what our purpose is? Lema'an yanuach avdecha ve'amatcha kamocha. Whole different story. One reason I kept the Shabbat because man and God and earth and heaven and the axis was vertical. What is happening with the new generation? What kind of a connection needs to happen? It needs to come this way. We need to strengthen our base, because when we try to go straight up without having a strong base, what happens? I always say, you put a pencil and you try to stand it up, what's going to happen? It's going to fall. You need a big foundation. You need a strong horizontal core in order to be able to do what? To build on it. And so here in Devarim, I'm not saying their faith. We try to build the religion on faith. Thank you for saying that. What's your name? Rosie. So Rosie is saying that the first, I don't know if you're saying this, but I'll say it with you and tell me if you agree. The first connection to God was a faith-based religion. You're taking the people and you're asking them to believe that God created the world. And if you try to just get to the height of, if you try to access religion or a connection with God in a purely faith-based way, where we say that what? That God created the world, belief in that is going to make him your God. If you want to find God, look to the heavens. If you want to find God, look to the Creator. And now Moshe is realizing, after 40 years in the desert and an entire career with leading people in the wilderness, he realized that the first thing that has to happen, if we want to recognize God, the first thing that has to happen is we have to recognize humanity. We have to recognize the physical. It's very hard to recognize or relate to an abstract.
Also, these people are about to enter the land, so this is more appropriate.
So
because
now
they're future-
also we have a moral
they're
issue.
actually laboring, they're gonna have to
Right.
work the-
So the first generation has no experience at all with being slave owners, with being landowners, with being gardeners and farmers. They can't relate to this. They have no idea what this is about.
they didn't own it.
So this is very practical because they're about to own a piece of land. And before you own the land, let me let you know what has to happen on
Work in
Shabbat.
6 days, and this is-
100%. And that's what's so beautiful about the Torah. The Torah is in and of itself addressing all aspects. It's addressing the vertical. It's addressing the horizontal, where it's saying, I need you to have a moral compass. I need you to be able to treat your servants like yourself on Shabbat. They get to rest too. And then it says, V'zacharta. Now, you didn't have to tell me this in Parashat Yitro. I have to remember that I was a slave in Egypt because what? I was the slave in Egypt. I am the first-hand account. I am the Holocaust survivor. I was there. I saw it. I saw the burning. I saw the ashes. You don't need to tell a Holocaust survivor to remember the Holocaust. They will never forget that. But 40 years later, and this is a little scary, 40 years, I'm not saying 400 years. 40 years is not a long time, but we already know that it's being erased from a lot of the history lessons. One generation, what's 40 years? Nothing. 40 years later, says the Torah, because we know that 40 is a cycle. And in 40 years, very easily, a nation that has sand between their toes, so you can't imagine that they don't know that their grandpa or their daddy came from Egypt. They're literally one generation, if not two. If their father wasn't born in Egypt, their grandfather was born in Egypt, one or the other. So at this point going into the land, they have to be remembered that you were a slave yourself in Egypt. And it could also be, that's why you have to be careful how you treat your servants, and they get to keep a Shabbat so that you could differentiate yourself from the taskmasters. When you do become a master, make sure that you have some decency towards your servants. And it says, "Vayotziacha Hashem Elohecha misham." Don't forget, God took you out of there with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, and he asked you to keep the Shabbat. What is the Shabbat? In Perashat Vaethanan, what is it leaning towards? If I told you that in Perashat Yitro, it was leaning to the past, towards the beginning of time, it takes us to the past. What is Shabbat doing here? It's taking us to the future. It's telling us how to keep Shabbat in the new land when we become landowners and when we become agriculturalists. It's telling us how to build a future. And that's the purpose of Shabbat. It's meant for us to look backward, and it's meant for us to look forward. I need two tellings of the story. And maybe one last piece, and I'll really end with this, is who spoke the 10 commandments the first time? God. Remember, the people couldn't even listen. It was too much for them to handle. So when God is the narrator, when God's holding the microphone saying, you need to keep the Shabbat, it would make a lot of sense that God's going to say, you need to keep the Shabbat because I created the world in 7 days. When man is holding the microphone, why do I need to keep the Shabbat when man is holding the microphone? Because it's not just that God created the world. It's because had God not taken me out of Egypt, I would not be a free man and I wouldn't be able to keep the Shabbat. Shabbat is confirming an entire history. I'm saying much more than just that God created the world. The commandments coming in Vaethanan are coming from below to above. They're coming from man and using, and I'll leave you with this, if you're going to educate, if you're going to teach something, then you have to use something relevant. Moshe understands that the people need something tangible. I can't really relate to the fact that God created the world. Me, myself, I'm being honest, it's a very hard thing for me to process what that really means. But I could relate to what tangible things God has done for me and my people. And that's Perashat Vaethanan saying, choose how you want to connect to God. Choose. You have 100 roads. I'm giving you a road that goes from below to above. I'm giving you a road that goes from above to below. I'm giving you a horizontal. I'm giving you present to past. I'm giving you present to future. What is God doing? He's creating, he's showing that our entire body, kol atzmotai, every part of our body correlates with some part of our history, with some part of the Torah, our heads, our feet, our arms. We can use every part of us to find a way to connect. And we could use every part of us to recognize, I may be deficient, whether it's physically, whether it's emotionally, whether it's economically, whatever I'm deficient in, what do I have? I have all of those other paths. I have all of those other avenues. Ravlach, you have a lot, says God. He's not speaking just to Moshe. He's telling every one of us, Ravlach, consider what you have. And I promise you, when you write those things down, you make a mental list, make a physical list, do whatever you want, write a gratitude list and write down all those things that you have to be thankful for. And don't just write them down. Keep them where? That's all in this parasha. You're going to have to keep those where? Literally in front of you. Because if you put in front of you the slides of the negativity, you won't be able to take one step forward. If you put in front of you the slides of the positive, you'll be able to say, let me move forward and let me be grateful for what I do have. And let's hope and pray that we go through these parshiyot. If you have time to read the Haftarah, it's the Nahamu Ami. It's the parasha of what? Of comfort. And this is the way we find comfort. We find comfort in celebrating our blessings. And with that, I thank all my Zoomers today. Thank you for joining. I'm sorry for the technical craziness, but that was very nice of you. And there's things in the chat. So let me see. You can unmute yourselves. I'll stay here. I'm not sure. I don't think Rabbi Besser is today. Yes, we can hear. If any, oh, I think I have to unmute you. I have to remember, she tells me every time I had to unmute, and I unmute, mute all, cancel. Let me see more. Don't mute upon entry. And thank you. I don't know. I keep forgetting every time she tells me how to mute everybody. Oh, you can talk if you want. If anybody, oh no, you're still.
Thank you for Zooming. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. I'm sorry it wasn't so,
It was fine. It was
Always
great.
good.
best we could.
Thank you.
Always good with you.
It was beautiful.
Ladies, look at this. My friend Sharon is here. How cute are they? I can't stand it.
Wonderful.
Yes, call me. Thank you for joining us. We're going to try and clean it up.
Thank you.
Polish it, clean up our act.
It was fine. We appreciate it
Thank you.
very much. Very much.
Thank
you
you.
very
It was,
much,
it was
Thank